Hello, welcome to our exploration of the Renaissance and Baroque movements in Europe. We begin with part 1 on the Renaissance in Italy and Northern Europe. Our map shows the major political entities in Europe around the year 1500, the height of the Renaissance. The Papal States in central Italy remained a stronghold of the Catholic Church, centered in Rome, and the influence of this religious institution spread throughout the entire continent as kings, dukes, and lords relied on the alliance with and approval of the Church to reign over their subjects. Despite the importance of the Church, a new interest in the classical past of ancient Greece and Rome stirred in the minds of intellectuals and artists throughout the increasingly economically independent and highly educated cities and courts, such as Florence in Italy and Amsterdam in the Netherlands. As we shall see, this time not only brought a renewed interest in naturalism and illusionism in art, but it also brought a new desire to explore the experiences of humans here in the world instead of intently focusing on judgment and the afterlife. The word Renaissance means rebirth, alluding to a revival of classical philosophies, pursuits, and ideals, as well as a renewed interest in the human experience. Art historians use the term Renaissance to refer to a specific point in history when artists demonstrated this revival through their unique treatments of Christian subject matter and themes relating to daily life, as well as stylistic features that emphasize illusionism, oftentimes making images appear to carry three-dimensional depth, weight, and volume on a two-dimensional surface. In intellectual circles and courts, the concept of humanism was influential, which stressed the experiences and domain of humanity rather than the realm of the divine. But even though religious subject matter was still prominent, an irreversible rift in the Catholic Church in the early 16th century would greatly affect religious institutions, political entities, and artists working for both these institutions and private patrons. Known as the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, this rift ultimately bore a new version of Christianity and created clear divisions among artists and individuals in Southern and Northern Europe. We begin with the early Renaissance in Italy, which comprises the late 13th century through the late 15th century. This phase is known for the first concentrated efforts to bring a studied, mathematical, and scientific approach to the depiction of the world. Just as the ancient Greeks had created images that reveal a studied interest in correct proportion, but also a desire to idealize, so too do the works from the early Renaissance in Italy combine the construction of believable space, perspective, and proportion with unbelievably perfect portrayals of mythological narratives, religious figures, and the human body. Many art historians point to a competition in Florence, Italy, as the beginning of the early Renaissance in the Italian peninsula. Florence was one of the most powerful and wealthy city-states in all of Europe by the start of the 15th century, and several industrial groups called guilds boasted their wealth and influence by commissioning artworks for public display throughout the city. One such guild commissioned a set of new gilded bronze panels for the doors of the baptistry, an octagonal building next to the city's cathedral, where the citizens of Florence were first baptized and proclaimed full members of the community. Though several artists submitted entries into the competition to win the commission, only 2 entries survive. One is seen here, made by the incredibly talented artist Filippo Brunelleschi, who had trained as a goldsmith and later worked as an architect as well. Like the other artists competing, Brunelleschi was assigned to depict a scene from the sacrifice of Isaac from the Old Testament in the Bible, when the figure of Abraham was ordered to sacrifice his only son in obedience to God. Just as Abraham was about to slice Isaac's throat, an angel stops the act, sent from God to spare Isaac's life in reaction to the display of unconditional devotion and surrender to God on the part of Abraham. Brunelleschi's panel is crowded, with figures stacked on top of each other to fill the entire compositional space. Action and drama are evident from the diagonal lines created by the leaning bodies of Abraham and Isaac, as well as the implied movement of the drapery on both Abraham and the angel swooping in on the left. Though his talent in creating realistic figures is undeniable, the arrangement and perspective of the scene does not make it convincing as an actual physical space. Alternatively, the entry submitted by Lorenzo Ghiberti not only matches Brunelleschi's drama, but also adds realistic illusionism. The figures of Abraham and Isaac display more realistic postures, as Abraham rears back in preparation for plunging his knife, and Isaac leans backwards in resistance and fear. The angel is foreshortened, giving us the impression of movement forward towards our own space. The landscape to the left separates the scene and makes it easier to read, as it also provides the illusion of depth and height that would be present in a real outdoor environment. Not surprisingly, Ghiberti wins the competition and the commission for the baptistry doors. Here are his finished panels, which all depict different scenes from the Old Testament. They are flanked on either side with human figures that mimic the statues of ancient Greece and Rome, complete with flowing drapery and contrapposto. It is believed that the great Renaissance artist and sculptor Michelangelo called these doors the gates of paradise upon viewing them, and they have maintained that label ever since. Let's take a closer look at one of the panels from the Gates of Paradise to see why Ghiberti's work demonstrates the achievements of the early Renaissance in Florence. What looks at first like a crowded scene is really several stories all in one composition. Jacob and Esau are the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah, and the stories of their birth and development is all in front of us. In the upper right corner, Rebekah wonders aloud to God why she experiences so much tumultuous activity in her womb, and the response is a warning that the older brother will serve the younger, which wouldn't make sense considering the bequest of a family's birthright upon the eldest son. In the distance under the arcade on the left, we see Rebekah reclined, having just given birth to the two sons. We also see other incidents, such as Esau going off to hunt at the right, Esau returning and speaking to Jacob in the midground in the center, father and son speaking in the foreground in the center, and Jacob deceiving his father to take Esau's birthright at the right, with Rebekah looking on. It would take a very knowledgeable viewer to understand all of these different scenes, suggesting that Florentine society, like the rest of Europe, was still devout and revolved around the teachings of the church and the lessons from the Bible. What is different about Ghiberti's treatment here, though, is his masterful portrayal of three-dimensional space through the placement and size of the figures, and his ability to make the viewer believe the emotions and gestures of the people through the attention to naturalistic gestures, postures, anatomy, and drapery. One of the reasons Ghiberti's scene looks like a believable space is because of a technique that the artist Masaccio also employed quite skillfully, called linear perspective. Linear perspective is the creation of illusionistic depth to give the impression of a three-dimensional environment on a two-dimensional surface. It employs a horizon line, an implied line that bisects the image horizontally, with a series of diagonal implied lines, called orthogonals, that all converge on one particular point along the horizon line, called a vanishing point. In this fresco, Masaccio has also created a continuous narrative with multiple parts of a story depicted in one visual composition. In order to help the viewer understand how to read this image, He has placed the figures along the horizon line and provided several implied lines to guide our ideas to the visual focal point, the vanishing point, which also serves as the most important part of the story. The horizon line follows the heads of the figures, who are Jesus Christ, his disciples, and a Roman tax collector. The vanishing point is the space of Jesus' halo, hovering just above his head. If you look carefully, you can see where Masaccio has placed the orthogonals. At the right, we begin at the foot of the tax collector, then upwards to the left towards the hitching post, the folds in St. Peter's drapery, the arm of the tax collector shown now with his back to us, and the blue drapery over Jesus' proper left shoulder all draw our eyes up to the vanishing point above his face. At the left, the same thing happens as we begin with the shadows on the ground and lead diagonally upwards, following the arm of St. Peter, identifiable again through his blue and orange drapery, and the faces of the disciples once more up to the space just above Jesus' face. Again, you would have to be a knowledgeable viewer to know what's going on. In the center, Jesus and his disciples are being confronted by the tax collector for money they owe, and Jesus instructs Peter to go to the water and catch a fish, which will have a gold coin in its mouth to pay the tax. We see Peter doing just that in the midground to the left, shown in a smaller scale to communicate his physical distance from us. The final part of the story is to the right, where Peter pays the tax collector with the coin he pulled from the fish. Masaccio, like Ghiberti, uses contrapposto in the stances and realistic folds in the clothing of these figures to emphasize their physical qualities, but arranges this scene not only to emphasize the natural and illusionistic quality, but also to keep drawing the viewer's eye and subsequently mind back to the main focus in this image and in the life of an average citizen in 15th century Florence, Jesus Christ. Not to be left out, sculptors like Donatello also employed these stylistic techniques to recall the achievements of the ancient Greeks and Romans while depicting Christian subjects. Donatello worked in marble and bronze, two materials used repeatedly by the classical civilizations to immortalize heroes, gods, and goddesses. In this sculpture, Donatello created a monumental version of St. Mark, seen here holding a book in his left arm, signaling his role in authoring parts of the Gospels in the New Testament of the Bible. Commissioned to fill one of the niches along the exterior of the building Or San Michele, a central structure in Florence that served many municipal purposes, from a granary to a church, Donatello's statue is perched above the heads of Florentine citizens as they pass by. He looks stoically out into the distance, as if deep in thought, and leans in an exaggerated contrapposto, demonstrating his intellectual and physical weight. One could easily mistake St. Mark for a Greek philosopher, such as Plato or Aristotle, hinting at Florence's new role in reviving the intellectual traditions of the past while celebrating the international prestige of the educated and wealthy citizens of the powerful city-state. The term High Renaissance is used to distinguish the works of artists in the 16th century from those of the 15th century, despite many stylistic and thematic similarities. Building upon the work of early Renaissance artists, the High Renaissance artists continue to emphasize the believability of their art, but focus just as much on the accurate portrayal of emotions and psychological states of people just as much as their physical states. In Florence, artists like Michelangelo continued to create works that recalled the styles of the ancient classical world, but dramatized the thoughts and feelings associated with the figures depicted. From 1501 to 1504, Michelangelo made a monumental sculpture of David, chiseling away from one enormous block of marble that had been worked on, then abandoned by earlier artists. Michelangelo gives us David, the Old Testament king whom we first knew as a young man who successfully defeated the giant Goliath with one shot of a rock from his sling. Although we can marvel at the incredible detail and precision in the depiction of David's physical body, we can also sense the intellectual intensity he experiences in this frozen moment just before fighting the giant. Originally meant to be displayed in a niche along the exterior of the Florence Cathedral, Michelangelo's statue was deemed too beautiful to be placed so far from view, and instead occupied a prominent place in the Piazza della Signoria. The focus, bravery, and beauty of David was a symbol of the spirit of Florence herself. As the Florentines had repeatedly fought off threats from outside forces and dangerous plague. More than just a demonstration of technical skill, this work reveals the new interest of the 16th century Renaissance artists to glorify the spirit of humanity and the achievements of man. Probably one of the most famous painters of the High Renaissance was Leonardo da Vinci, who not only experimented with new materials, but also with new approaches to familiar subjects and artistic genres. The Last Supper is a scene from the life of Jesus, described in the New Testament of the Bible, when Jesus dines one last time with his disciples and announces that one of them will betray him, resulting in his arrest and execution by crucifixion at the hands of the Roman authorities. Usually, Jesus and 11 of his disciples would be seated on one side of the table, and the betrayer, Judas, would be seated on the other. However, Leonardo broke from that approach by grouping all 12 disciples into groups of 3 on the same side of the table on either side of Jesus, who is clearly and calmly planted in the center. Leonardo makes excellent use of linear perspective here, giving plenty of implied lines from the hands, arms, and items on the table that lead to the space just above Jesus' head. But Leonardo also employs atmospheric perspective, which is the delineation of 3-dimensional space with the creation of a foreground, midground, and background by making elements in the foreground largest and thus seeming to be closest, and elements in the background smallest and just farthest away. What's more, Leonardo's figures do not bear the telltale signs of Christian holiness and halos. Instead, they appear to behave and look like real men reacting to shocking and troubling news. Like Michelangelo, Leonardo stresses realism through both technical illusionism and through the depiction of emotions. Unfortunately, the condition of Leonardo's fresco is fragile and constantly in danger of destruction. Leonardo enjoyed the vibrancy of oil paint that artists in Northern Europe were using, and sought to add colorful intensity to his image by mixing oil paint into the water-based medium of fresco. And ultimately, the material began separating and flaking off soon after the composition was finished. Conservators over the years have tried their best to preserve the image, and thanks to the innovations of recent decades, about 40% of Leonardo's original painting still exists on the surface today. Thankfully, there are other frescoes from the High Renaissance that have fared much better than Leonardo's Last Supper. In Rome, the artist Raphael was commissioned to paint frescoes on the walls of the Pope's study, called the Stanza della Segnatura, within the Papal Palace of the Vatican. Considering the subject matter, the location of this fresco may come as a surprise. What we have is nothing short of a who's who of ancient Greece, filled to the brim with figures who all lived before Christ and the Catholic Church. In the center are Plato, on the left with the purple gown and red drapery, and Aristotle on the right with the green gown and blue drapery. two of the most significant philosophers of ancient Greece. Plato explained that what we experience on earth is not reality, but a mere copy of it, and not a very good imitation either, hence the fact that he gestures upwards, reminding viewers that reality is something beyond us. Whereas Aristotle explained that reality is actually what we do experience here in this world, and that we should be more aware and focused on cultivating behaviors that seek to improve and harmonize our existence here. Hence the fact that he gestures outwards, towards the space of us, the viewers, who occupy the real world in that very moment. All around Plato and Aristotle are groups of individuals who seem to be engaged in exciting conversation and debate, some about philosophy and history, others about science and mathematics. Clearly, not all of these individuals would have been able to occupy the same physical space at the same time. So Raphael is offering us an illusionistic portrayal of an imagined gathering of the minds, but does this so compellingly that we can see the textures, space, weight, and volume of both the people and this marbled and monumental space they occupy. It's as if Raphael is inviting the viewer, even the Pope, to attend the imagined school of Athens, simply by keeping their discoveries and ideas alive in our own hearts and minds. The space in the central foreground is even left empty, as if inviting us to step in and take our spot in the pantheon of intellectuals as well. Working at the same time as Raphael, just down the corridor in the chambers of the Vatican, was Michelangelo, now employed as a painter by Pope Julius II. He was commissioned to paint an incredible cycle of frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the sacred space where the College of Cardinals, the governing body of the papacy, gathers to select the new pope. Considering the obviously religious space and context of the chapel, it would have been difficult for Michelangelo to eschew religious imagery the way Raphael did. Instead, Michelangelo painted scenes from the book of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, and thus the beginning of the Bible. He lines up these scenes chronologically down the center of the ceiling, making the narratives easy to read for knowing audiences, and surrounds these scenes with painted architectural platforms and columns, painted images meant to look like sculptures, and a variety of mythological figures situated within triangular niches of painted architectural frames. It is astonishing that Michelangelo was able to paint this entire ceiling, spending most of his time flat on his back atop a tall scaffold, in just a few short years. As amazing as the whole ceiling is from below, a closer look at one of Michelangelo's most famous scenes reveals the true majesty of his endeavor. This scene is called the creation of Adam, when God gives life to the world's first man, whom he himself has created. Adam looms large at the left, lounging lifelessly as he struggles to reach his hand towards God, who extended his arm and hand with muscular energy. The stillness of Adam is directly contrasted with the movement of God, as his garments and billowing cape seem to fly to the right, and the angelic figures huddled within the cape seem to hold on for dear life. God wraps his proper left arm around a female figure, likely Eve, who will soon join Adam on earth. However, some believe this female figure to also symbolize the Virgin Mary, who will bear the Son of God and redeem the progeny of Adam and Eve from sin. And perhaps that son is alluded to in the baby figure where God's proper left hand rests. Adam and God are framed in a painted architectural frame, with nude mythological figures seated at the corners to help delineate the transitions between scenes. Michelangelo has not prioritized the realistic illusion of three-dimensional space as much as the other Renaissance artists, but he does show a great deal of interest in portraying the physical weight of the figures and the psychological weight of the moment through the bulky bodies and sturdy, solid forms. Even the side figures twist and turn, their gestures and facial expressions revealing some degree of emotional response and intellectual contemplation in reaction to the moment when life first begins. Before we conclude our survey of the Renaissance, we must spend a little time looking at examples of the Northern Renaissance, which varied greatly from the Renaissance in Italy. Though many of the same themes were explored by artists in Northern Europe, such as biblical narratives, many artists preferred to depict scenes with more intensity in color and texture through the use of oil paints, a medium not widely used in Italy until further into the 16th century. As we shall see, works from the Northern Renaissance tended to emphasize particular virtues and qualities in both holy figures and individuals from the contemporary world, using meticulous detail and symbolism embedded throughout the imagery. These images did not stress the formation of illusionistic space as much, preferring instead to communicate specific messages to viewers through color, texture, and the presence of specific objects. One of the masters of the Northern Renaissance is undoubtedly Jan van Eyck, a painter who worked in Flanders, now modern Belgium. His painting, known as the Arnolfini portrait, shown on the left, is a beautiful example of the precision, vibrancy, and texture possible with oil paint. Since pigments mixed with oils take more time to dry, artists can achieve smoother blending effects between different tones and shades of color. This ability to create three-dimensional modeling through the use of different color tones on a two-dimensional surface is called chiaroscuro, which emphasizes the realism of the scene. The folds of the drapery in the deeply saturated green dress of Arnolfini's wife seem to hover over a real physical body, and the texture of the fur-lined coat on Arnolfini himself, to the left, seems soft enough to touch. This is possibly a wedding portrait, but its true purpose is still a mystery. The little brown dog in the foreground is often a symbol of fidelity, and the man's shoes at the left and the women's shoes in the background below the red bed in the center bear a kind of familiarity and comfort within a domestic space, something shared by a married couple. The right side of this slide shows a close-up detail of the central background of the painting, where a mirror hangs on the wall. Van Eyck has signed the wall above the mirror and given us an accurate reflection of the backs of Arnolfini and his wife, as well as the reflection of two witnesses standing before them, supposedly occupying the same space as us, the viewers. The frame of the mirror shows tiny images of scenes from the death of Christ, and a rosary strand hangs on the wall, suggesting the piety and religious devotion of this couple. That helps counter the material wealth on full display here, shown in the definite and intricate detail by the artist's deliberate and skillful hand. A more explicitly religious scene is shown here in the Marode altarpiece painted by Robert Campin, known as the Master of Flamaille. This is a triptych, meaning an altarpiece made of 3 wooden panels that can fold up to close. On the left are images of the donors, those who paid for the painting, and they appear ready to walk into the interior space shown on the central panel, which is actually a depiction of the Annunciation, the moment when the angel Gabriel arrives to tell Mary that she will miraculously bear the Son of God. Mary's husband, Joseph, toils at his carpenter's bench in the panel at the far right. The collapsing of real space and time with biblical narratives flows easily in this scene, as the Flemish world blends easily with the world of these holiest of Christian figures, Campan also utilized oil paint's ability to blend easily, giving the fabrics in the scenes movement and weight with the lightening and darkening of colors. This clearly is not a representation of three-dimensional space that is believable, though, as we saw in the Italian Renaissance. Campan tips the table in the central panel and the workbench in the right panel upwards, as if they are tilting towards us, while we still view the human figures frontally. Instead of making this feel like a real illusionistic scene, then, Campan wants to make us feel the quiet calm of the moment just before Mary receives the biggest news of her life. All around the room where she and the angel Gabriel are situated are objects that remind viewers of the qualities Mary displayed, from the white lily flower in the vase on the table, to the scriptures she reads, to the candle that has just been blown out from the movement of the angel's arrival. If you look really closely, you can even see a tiny image of the baby Jesus swooping in from the windows at the left, flying just above Gabriel's wings, headed straight for Mary's womb. With scenes like this, viewers were not expected to believe that they could walk in and join the scene themselves. Instead, they could marvel at the colors and details of a familiar-looking space and environment while contemplating the holy attributes of the mother of their Savior. Altarpieces such as this would have been located in chapels within bigger churches or cathedrals, used as aids to focus the attention of believers and give viewers, who were mostly illiterate, an opportunity to read the meanings of the scene for themselves. The last work we will look at is called The Ambassadors by the artist Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein worked for some of the most prominent royal courts in Europe during the 16th century, and here he is depicting two important individuals who frequented such important spaces. On the left is the French ambassador to England, named Jean de Danville, and on the right is the Bishop of Lavar, who also served as ambassador to Venice and Rome. Like the Arnolfini portrait, this is not an overtly religious image, but instead depicts two contemporary individuals surrounded by objects that allude to religious teachings and practice. The main difference, though, is that by the time Holbein painted this work, the major schism in the Catholic Church had already begun. In 1517, Martin Luther, a Catholic monk living in Wittenberg, in modern Germany, publicized his 95 complaints against the Church and accused it of corruption for selling indulgences, which offered believers less time in purgatory for themselves and their loved ones in exchange for money paid to the Church. Popes like Julius II had spent lavishly decorating the Vatican with works by Raphael and Michelangelo, and continued to revitalize the public appearance of Rome with the renovation of St. Peter's Basilica, also at great expense. Since the Catholic Church at the time claimed that good works allowed believers to gain salvation, and paying money to the Church was one way of individuals to complete these good works, it seemed like a win-win scenario, except for the fact that individuals were being financially exploited by those who were supposedly meant to ensure their spiritual well-being. In the years that followed, most provinces in Northern Europe split from the Catholic Church in favor of the new teachings of Luther and his followers, couched in the umbrella term Protestants, that emphasized faith alone to achieve salvation and minimized the role of art in religious practice. Considering all this, artists like Holbein switched their stylistic and thematic focus to concentrate on portraits and genre paintings of contemporary individuals and daily life, and gestured subtly to religious themes in order to communicate the lessons of the teachings and the virtues of the individuals shown. For example, these ambassadors flank a table and shelf covered in instruments relating to discoveries in geography, science, and cartography. And the musical instruments below sit next to a hymn book, indicating the use of such artistic pursuits in religious devotion. A distorted skull is also present, known as a memento mori in art, which is a reference to the inescapable mortality of man and the need to live in a righteous way to prepare for the inevitable judgment that we will face at the end of our lives. Holbein assembles this scene with particular attention to making these items visible to viewers, allowing us to make connections between the ideas and actions they symbolize and the men who appear before us. This concludes our brief look at the art of the Renaissance in Italy and Northern Europe.